Okay, we've heard a lot this morning, in the early afternoon, about Scotland, the character of the Scots, and being very different from the character of Southern rulers in many ways, and that is also the case far back in history. I was asked to have a look at the claim of right after I joined Salvo, coming on 3 years ago, from a human rights perspective. And despite the fact that I've been working alongside and from a small part helping develop human rights in Scotland, then I was really shocked about how many of those statements within the frame of right could be seen in today's modern human rights treaties and instruments. We have a long-standing record of devising and delivering rights for our people, and that began long before the Declaration of the Clergy in 1310, where it was first came to notice then, and one of the outcomes of that was it was one of the early declarations of Scottish independence and the right to exist as a sovereign state. So for well over 700 years, Scots have had those rights, but they were interrupted almost 400 years after the claim of right by the Treaty of Union. Those early rights included, of course, the right to self-determination. And after an interruption of 318 years, Scotland is once again looking to have those rights restored. Move on to the early foundation. As I mentioned, the claim of the Declaration of the Clergy in 1310, the more famous declaration 10 years later, our growth, proclaimed a conditional kingship. In other words, the king's authority was only held in trust for the people. The people were the final authority. And should the king fail in his duties to protect the nation, then he could be replaced by one who could do the job. Sort of an ancient power of recall, as you have today in Switzerland. In 1328, the Treaty of Edinburgh and Northampton was another recognition of Scotland's sovereignty and independence, this time by England. And it was one of the many hundreds of treaties, I think, Sarah would probably tell me, that have been broken consistently by England. And that includes the Treaty of 1707 and many of those, as you all know. I move on to some local governance way back. The Convention of the Royal Burghs was developed from the commissioners of the boroughs, and they had the right to be heard. This was the closest body to the people of Scotland at the time, and they had the right to be heard on issues such as war, taxation, trade, and other major decisions of the Scottish Parliament. And the earliest hearing of the commissioners was in 1326 at Cambuskeneth, and the first statutory mention of the convention was in 1487. 1487, it lasted until 1975, where under Westminster's reorganisation of local government in Scotland, it was abolished. And that began a gradual move of decision making further and further and further away from the people. Another of the, well, I don't call it peculiarities, or one of the common factors of Scots that has still exists today, despite the fact that the Act bringing it into being was in 1491, and that was the Common Good Act that recognised that the wealth of the community had to be spent to support the community. But that changed rapidly, and very rapidly and massively in 1707, and a change from the concept of the common good to that of corporate and private greed, as was witnessed by the development of the English Empire. The common good still exists in Scotland. There are many hundreds of those funds still in place. Nowadays they're administered by the local authorities on behalf of the people of the previous boroughs. And as I mentioned, they were scrapped in 1917. Those boroughs were scrapped in 1975, well over 600 years of service to their communities. I've been asked to add a little bit about the Crown of Scotland, but there's been extensive talk on that already. It's very different to that in England, and as Sarah's already mentioned, the Crown in England is the monarch through Parliament. The Crown in Scotland is the people, the community of the realm, communitas regni. And to carry on from that, the Act of Salvo, after which our campaigning organisation Salvo is named, was first mentioned in 1952, enacted in 1663, and gives the people rights to challenge decisions taken in Scottish courts and Parliament. The people were the ultimate authority and had political sovereignty and the right to depose a king and his Parliament, as shown in the claim of right 1688, when James VII was deposed. The Crown of Scotland still exists, and so does the authority of the people. But that information has been kept well hidden, as has much of Scotland's history. Several times the Westminster Parliament has the opportunity to defend its sovereignty, and yet it has backed down from that challenge on a number of occasions in the 20th century and 21st century. The Act of Salvo required the Scottish Parliament to end with the offer of salvo, the right to challenge decisions made in Scottish courts and the Scottish Parliament. However, at the most important point in Scotland's history, the final day of the Scottish Parliament, salvo was not offered. And it was a legal requirement. Some legal experts and historians will tell you that with no offer of salvo, the Scottish Parliamentary session could not be closed. Just when Scotland needed the voice of the people, a strange thing happened. Throughout the sessions debating the union with England, Scottish commissioners were in regular attendees, with often 62 out of a total of 67 turning up. Yet, on the day of the final vote, only 19 turned up. Where were they?
How's the rest?
Yeah, that question will never be able to answer 300 odd years later. The boroughs were among the strongest critics of the Union, so as I said, there were almost 100 anti-Union petitions were read to the Parliament, mainly from the boroughs, but no petitions in favour. Yet, where were they when the final vote was taken? Okay, I've lost that section, so never mind. Modern day human rights, the human rights that we have in place today can be traced back all the way to 1310, and as Scotland developed, those rights have now been seen in the American Constitution, in the UN Charter, in numerous UN treaties and instruments, all developed through what we had here in Scotland prior to 1707. To bring it up to date, the human rights system in Scotland is very much like the governments of Scotland. It's a dual system whereby reserved matters are only dealt with by the Equality and Human Rights Commission, in brackets Scotland. The devolved matters are dealt with by the Scottish Human Rights Commission, and that's then by the Judicial Week. And that's exactly the same as it is with our governments. Recently, we've been trying to introduce a new human rights bill for Scotland. and that would bring in 4 international human rights treaties, the rights of the child, race equality, women's rights, and the rights of people with a disability. And we were going to introduce environmental rights, rights of older people, all those rights that have never been actually through the UN. However, when we sent the rights of the child down for Royal Assent, it was rejected by Westminster and sent to the Supreme Court, and in 2021 they rejected that bill because Scottish Parliament did not have competency in 6 areas, i.e. it interfered with Westminster's right for them to make law for Scotland. And a year later, they did exactly the same thing, using exactly the same procedure when the Scottish Parliament, asked for a referendum. So it's a difficult position because if you have a case that has a reserved matter and also a devolved matter, you have to deal with 2 different human rights organisations. That's what's great. I'll just finish by saying that Liberation Scotland fully supports the efforts of our human rights defenders and organisations, as well as our legislature in delivering for all people the realisation of their human rights. We want the restoration of all the rights Scots once had centuries ago and to incorporate all modern human rights and optional protocols into Scots law. The history of rights for the people are fundamental to the character of Scots. And for my part, Liberation for Scotland means once again that we play a pivotal role in the development and realisation of human rights for all, no matter their personal circumstances or where in the world people live. Thank you.